Hello, welcome back. This is part two of our discussion about early Christian art and the transformation all the way through the medieval period to the late Gothic. And when we last left off, just to remind you, we were here and we were talking about the end, kind of the late period of the Roman Empire, right around when Constantine converted to Christianity, and how there was already the hint of these changes in Roman art becoming this transformation to early Christian art. And so, also, I'd like to apologize, for one of my dogs barking in the middle of the other lecture, very strangely loud, um, and also ending so abruptly. I don't know why exactly that happened. It just kind of ended right when I said done. Okay, anyway, so as we look at some of the artwork of this period, we start to see these developments where this transformation is happening. And a really good example of this is this sarcophagus piece right here, where it quite literally both looks very classical in some ways. It feels like it's adopting many classical motifs, but in the same way, especially like in the proportion kind of issues, the scale of heads and important kind of details like narrative details like hands, the scale of those parts to the overall relationship of the body doesn't feel at all classical, and it starts to feel some form of proto-medieval, proto-Christian. It is actually a Christian sarcophagus. And these changes can be seen as with the, with the spreading of this new religion and the importance of narrative, of story within this religion, the importance of narrative communication, and making sure that the images really clearly communicate. That maybe is part of what some of these changes are about, and also almost certainly about the influence from other parts of the world, both influence from the Gaelic part of the world and later from the Germanic parts of the world, as well as all the other parts of the empire that the Romans controlled. Um, and then the other thing that I want to say on this particular slide is the importance of the Basilica. The Basilica is a Roman architectural form that essentially is a long building with a series of colonnades on either side. And here we see a very old-fashioned version of a basilica. This is the Basilica Oppia, which was built in the 2nd century CE, otherwise known as AD. And it is these buildings were primarily for public use. They were often places where law courts were held here, and they were essentially public meeting spaces, similar to what the Greeks would have used an agora for. Um, but this form, the basilica form, becomes adopted by the Christians. The Christians have a need in their church structure, which was very different from what most ancient religions needed. Um, the Christian church needed a large meeting space where people could worship together. Um, Most of ancient worship involved, if there was any kind of group activities, they were usually processions, and they were in the outside, like the Athenic procession outside the Parthenon would go, all the way through the city up to the Parthenon and then around it. But the idea of everyone gathering inside a building to worship was not part of most religions of the ancient world, but it was a major, important part of the early Christian church. And so they needed to build spaces where people could gather together and worship together. And so the logical thing was these kind of large public halls that the Romans had already been making, the basilica. So the basilica becomes the basic model for a church. And here we see Santa Sabina, which is a pretty old early Christian church from still the end of the Roman Empire, and we can really see how it's being how they're using this form, but in a much more kind of modest, humble kind of way. And then if we look at another one, hold on a second, if we look at another one, well, that's Santa Sabina as well, which is gorgeous on the inside. You know, on the outside, like I said, it looks kind of humble, but on the inside it is it's a beautiful building. Um, and you can see how it in some ways feels quite Roman, but also very Christian. But then at a much grander scale, we have something like the Basilica Santa Maria and Maggiore. And, and this is kind of taking this kind of Roman model of a basilica form and making it work for a church space. And so one of the things that we see always in a basilica form is an aisle. That is, that there's a space behind this colonnade, usually supported by arches right there. You can see them right there. And we will see that again and again um, in in basilica type churches. And then we also have kind of a sense of a transept. You see a little bit here. This will become more and more developed as we look at more basilica based churches, that eventually they start to actually be structured like crosses. Um, okay, that is the end of this next part of the lecture, which I think was actually quite short. I will get to you with part 3.